And she said, no, she thought she'd called me. I thought, oh, hell, I don't think that's quite the case, and I really feel I should get this thing squared away once and for all. But
well, she's been terribly distracted, and it's an irritation.
Well, it is. It is.
But I'll tell you, July 22nd, we were in Washington D.C.
I've got a mic that I need to put in a little. Wait a minute. What? How's that? Is that okay? Okay, fine. Thanks, James.
Yeah. July 22nd, we're in Washington D.C. and the man before the camera today is Jim Ketchum. Jim, why don't you start off? First of all, let me tell you, you know pretty well what we're after. We're not really looking for substantive history. We're looking for colorful stuff about the president and Mrs. Johnson.
Okay.
And so why don't you start off by telling what you were doing during the Johnson years that put you in contact with the president and Mrs. Johnson?
Well, the first thing I did that put me in contact was help Mrs. Johnson unpack some of the things that she was bringing in on the first 2 or 3 days that they moved into the White House. This was the beginning of the second week of December of 1963, and she called down to our office. I have to explain that the Curator's office was one of a handful of offices in the White House itself. We were located down on the ground floor of the residence across from the diplomatic reception room. This was something called the Old Kitchen until the Eisenhowers got there, and then Ike's television advisor, Robert Montgomery, decided to use that as a studio space. Television was in its infancy, and instead of doing radio fireside chats a la FDR, they wanted to make sure that Ike was able to be in everyone's living room courtesy of that television box. And so this low-ceilinged, somewhat strangely configured quarters became the broadcast room for only 1 or 2 times. The type of lights that had to be used in 1953 were such that Ike was perspiring from the top of his good ball dome right down to his toes, so everything was moved over to his office, and this became Mrs. Eisenhower's toy room. She had a friend named Louis Marks, who was a toy manufacturer in New York, and she had wanted to bring White House staff together each Christmas and give them all appropriate toys. So Marks was the giver, and she played Mrs. Santa Claus. Well, to come up to 1963, we had been there, probably since about the second year. We moved into that space in 1960, early 62. We'd been across the room in the hall in what is now the map room. Anyway, Mrs. Johnson called down. I took the elevator upstairs, and I found her in a closet between her bedroom and sitting room, on her hands and knees, with a cardboard box open in front of her, and these English porcelain birds designed by a sculptress named Dorothy Dowdy. And they had all been wrapped quite carefully by friends and what have you at the Elms, and had been carried up. So I got down and started unwrapping with her. And what neither one of us realized is that the light for the closet was in the door jamb. And as we started, and we had the birds kind of lined up on the floor, the Bonner Arrington and one of his colleagues from the carpenter shop, moving in a sofa, went right down this narrow corridor and of course closed the door. And so there we were, playing touchy-feely, trying to protect the birds and figure out how one could get up without stepping on something. And I'm blessed with size 15 shoes, so my idea was to hopefully Mrs. Johnson would rise before I did, because I knew darn well that I'd take out 3 Dorothy Dowdy birds and God knows what all else. That was my introduction. I mean, we had met at some of the social events at the White House, but never really that kind of meeting. And from there, it just went on and got better and better and better. And for somebody who'd been used to those Massachusetts accents of the Kennedy forces, it was quite a shock to my nervous system to listen to what was coming up from the great Lone Star State. But within oh golly, within days of that point, she said, I'd like to set aside as much time as we can over the next few weeks, and we'll have what are called walk and learns. In other words, we would just take one room at a time, discuss its history, look at its furnishings, try to put everything in perspective as far as the story that these objects in these rooms would tell, so that she in turn could share with family and friends and guests as they would come to the White House. And sure enough, I think it was January when the press was allowed to come into the family quarters for the first time, and the papers were filled with tales about toothpaste tubes that were pinched in the middle instead of rolled up at the end, and on and on and on it went. And it was phenomenal. I mean, it was just a house that was going to be shared, and its story would be shared as well.
Your relationship with her became pretty close over the years.
I certainly felt very comfortable with her. I found her to be an amazing person. Unlike the two other spouses with whom I worked, Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Nixon, Mrs. Johnson went to work every day. She literally did. She had a schedule, and she had a way of handling her business that was really, it was discipline. It was indeed. I think there were any number of things that fascinated me about her as I got to know her, but one in particular was the way she had kind of a reverie about her. I'd go upstairs, and before I'd knock on the door, she usually was in her sitting room, and as you know only too well, she loved it because it had one door and she could control access, but she'd be humming away, sometimes singing, almost in a kind of a reverie, this peaceful but very happy state, which many years ago as a child, she learned to develop this world that was going to be part and parcel of a place that she could put herself in and recharge those batteries. And God knows she needed to do it, and do it in a special way, and she did. But the comfort level, I never saw anyone. I never saw her directly admonish anyone when anyone else was around. She never seemed to want to embarrass. Rather, if anyone was doing what she considered an honest effort, she would always support them and praise them. A couple of times I recall her being a little uncertain of what had happened. One was the day after the Eartha Kitt situation, when Bess and Liz and I were meeting with her for something else. Could have been a wedding, but in any event, she pondered that for a good bit of the time that we were there. And another time, Liz and I got into a round and round and round over the Ralph Becker collection. Ralph Becker had wanted to loan, or with the possibility of giving to the White House, his collection, or a portion of his collection, of political memorabilia. And I, who was responsible for a series of exhibits that lined the East Corridor, where the public came into the White House before they got to the staircase to rise up to the state floor, we had done White House brides, we'd done state dinners, we'd done all kinds of things, did not really feel that we should politicize that area, even though we were talking about memorabilia that would harken back to the 1820s or what have you. And Liz very much did. And finally, Mrs. Johnson said, "You're just sounding like a couple of children. I'll make the decision. You stop whatever you're saying and let me take care of it." And Mrs. Johnson did, and she decided that the Ralph Becker collection would not come to the White House, which was fantastic, because hopefully the Johnson Library was able to succeed on that front. But anyway, she just never lost it. She really didn't. And she, her ability to be interrupted and to give the kind of time to the person interrupting her that she had just been giving to those who were meeting, I mean, it was an amazing way of keeping all those balls in the air, but in the most loving and kind-hearted way she did it. And how she did it is something that somebody will have to try to decide someday, because it's beyond me, really is.
Before we move to the present, you had some contact with the daughters.
Yeah, I did. I grew up in a family with 4 sisters and 2 brothers, so having a 15 or 16-year-old and an 18 or a 19-year-old was just doing what comes naturally. I was let's see, in 1963, I turned 24, and I was only in that job just because of a fluke. It was one of those situations where I'd been in the office the longest, and when Mrs. Kennedy put me in that spot, it was the understanding that a year hence, hopefully, somebody else would come along who had more experience. I had some graduate work in American paintings, but not, and some art history, no studio art, but not really enough to make me qualify for what I felt that that position ought to have. But when the girls discovered, when Linda, for example, came back with Worry Lynn Smith and discovered that there was a good-sized desk in the curator's office that she could use for study and get away from the family quarters and so forth, I found that my desk was now a part and parcel of her territory after about 8 o'clock at night. And I had no problem with this whatsoever. This was just fine until I discovered that the reason that we were having a reoccurring rodent problem in the office, and I wish I could say these were mice, but they were slightly larger than mice, was because Linda was taking her crackers, cookies, and so forth, and leaving them scattered around as she finished each evening. And so I picked up the phone and I called her, and I suppose anyone else would have been much more polite about this than I was, but I said, Linda, you can come down here all hours, no problem at all, but you're going to have to take those damn crackers and take them with you each time, because I cannot be putting up with what's been going on. And she understood completely and was very apologetic, and all went well. So much so that the night that she and Chuck decided to get married, they were having dinner at our house. She'd been in England, apparently still seeing her friend George Hamilton a bit, but had also been seeing Chuck back here, and we were doing a little birthday party for Worry Lynn. It was the summer of 1967, yeah. And so she came back the early morning on arrived of the evening of the birthday party, and Worry called and said, would Barbara mind adding 2 more to the list? And I said, no, not at all. I said, who? And she said, well, it's Linda and a friend of hers named Chuck Robb. And I said, oh, that's fine, no difficulty at all. So they came. Linda was somehow able to exist without very much sleep at that point, and we had a great evening, except I remember the air conditioning going off in the middle of dinner. It was one of those 95-degree and 95% humidity nights, and we're sitting around the dining room table at that point and just about ready to have dessert. And Barbara had made a great bomb of ice cream in the shape of a melon. So it was pistachio for green on the outside, and then there was some lemon sherbet for a thin layer, and then the large was a raspberry sherbet. And this was on a compote or a cake plate about yay high, with what looked like a machete to cut it. And Linda was going to serve the first piece, and she went down with this thing, and the whole damn missile went right across the table and landed in somebody's lap. So we pulled it back and started all over again. But fortunately, because the lights had gone out and we were doing this all with candlelight, it looked much more interesting than it really was. Anyway, that's the night she went home and crawled in on her hands and knees and tapped her mother on the arm to come out so she could tell her that Chuck had asked to marry her. And unfortunately, she wrote about it in, I think it was in McCall's a few months later, and when all of Barbara's unmarried cousins read about it, they all called and wanted the menu immediately to see if some kind of magic was here. Lucy was, you know, again, I had sisters younger than Lucy, and they also got help from their older brother on occasion on some of their papers, both in history and in fine arts and what have you. And so nothing was any different there whatsoever. She would come down with the subject matter from school, and we would develop the resources, and she would do a draft, and then I would play a few changes and send it back to her, and back and forth we would go, and the papers would go in. And if she didn't get a good mark, I soon heard about it, because she had put an awful lot of work into doing it, and I'm afraid I was probably a little bit too stern as a taskmaster on all that. But they were great, and they were again typical of the Johnsons were the one family that I observed who worked with people during the day and then played with them at night. I mean, truly, it was just the extended family. And you could find yourself working in a country fair on the South Lawn at one point, and God knows what else you were doing that was all part and parcel of their helping to entertain and produce. And of course, you had with Bess and Liz people who should have been keeping David Merrick and Company going strong. I mean, all those ingredients coming together. It was just one of the yeastiest, most amazing situations. And fortunately, all of us were young enough to really take advantage as far as the enjoyment factor. No two ways.
What was your first encounter with President Johnson?
I first saw him up close the week, it could have been Saturday morning on the 23rd of November. My first memory is standing out on the South Lawn on the evening of the 22nd and watching one chopper after another land. Now granted, many of them were coming from Andrews, in fact probably all of them, but he had called a meeting of cabinet and congressional leaders for that night, and I guess most of them had gone out to the airport when Air Force One came in. And then they were all piled, but it was this strange system strange, almost eerie feeling that the sky was emptying out all of these forces that were coming, and then they were getting out, walking over to the West Wing and another chopper, but it was just done on almost precision, split timing. I'm sure that there were several that were circling ahead, and that's my first sense that things had really, the torch had been passed. And then the next day, he and Mrs. Johnson must have been in the ground floor corridor. I had spent the night getting prints from Harper's and Frank Leslie's that showed the Lincoln setting of the East Room for the catafalque and the casket for the Lincoln funeral, because Mrs. Kennedy had called from Bethesda and wanted to have certain things done as far as the preparation for the lying in state in the East Room. And then after that, oh golly, it would be sometime in December, it would seem to me, Harry, that when I would be upstairs talking to her and he would be dashing in or out. I remember Valenti was up on the third floor staying there. I'm trying to think. It was pretty much, they didn't bring too many things with them from the Elms, as I recall. Just their bedroom furniture. That was pretty much it at that point. And he was obviously spending an awful lot of time. I remember going down to a ceremony in the, I guess it was in the state dining room, when he was, it was an award ceremony. It could have been something that he was carrying out that Kennedy had planned. I'm not sure. But those are my earliest memories of him as president.
How about some memorable encounters?
Well, I think the thing that always, whenever I saw him in a small group, was how he just, no matter who was in the room, people of whatever their import and their status, he could take over immediately, just by virtue of his size and the way he literally, figuratively and literally, embraced people. Averell Harriman had wanted to see that the White House received a bust of Winston Churchill, and there was one available by Jacob Epstein, the American-born British sculptor who had done Churchill really very much at his prime. And so what Harriman did was he got Ed Murrow's widow and General Ira Aker and a whole slew of people who had been associated with Churchill during wartime London, And they all put their money down, and purchase was made. Mrs. Johnson said we really should have an appropriate evening reception, but because there were not that many people involved, probably 10 donors in all, and we'll invite Churchill's grandson to come over. So indeed, then young Winston, as he was referred to, arrived on scene, and Harriman was very much part of it, and Janet Murrow, Ed Murrow's widow, I remember being there. Everybody had gathered, and suddenly everyone looked up, and in walked the president. And it was, you can have Harriman, who'd been dealing with Stalin and dealing with anyone else, but the center of attention was very much the President of the United States. And in any situation, the President would be taking precedence, and the power of the personality would show through. But here, it was just done at a level that you'd never see anyplace else. And I include Kennedy in that, certainly, as well, no matter what magic was coursing through those pores of this good man. It was really evident that people were completely taken and dominated by him. I can remember occasions when he wanted something done, oftentimes be at lunchtime. One of my favorite memories is when I was called up, never told why you were expected to be on scene. You were just asked to come upstairs, and I think Marie probably called. Anyway, I went up, and he'd been up on the hill visiting, or maybe McCormick had come down, I'm not sure. But anyway, McCormick had a bronze that he wanted to give to the president, and something that could continue to be seen down at the library. And I went up, and that was present and accounted for, but that's not why he wanted to see me. He was waving this wooden shaft in my face, saying, "Here, do something with this." And I said, "What is it, Mr. President?" And he said, "Well, it's a pepper mill. Can't you see it's a pepper mill?" It looked like some kind of a mace that King Arthur would have at the round table. "And it doesn't work. The damn thing's broken." And of course, it was something that the Japanese had given him, and I don't know whether the battery contacts were gone or whatever else, but he said, "I know curators can fix anything. Take it away." So I said, "Yes, sir, I will." And I took it away, and I remember calling the Japanese embassy to see if they could tell me whence it cometh and so forth, and we ultimately replaced it, and he had his electric pepper grinder. And this past Christmas, believe it or not, my good wife, as one of her Christmas gifts, gave me an electric pepper grinder. So now I can travel with this and do show and tell, and hark back nearly 40 years on this experience.
Were your own personal experiences with Johnson always pleasant?
Yeah, they really were. I don't have. I think I was far enough removed because we were in the mansion proper. I mean, sure, I would see him quite often, but I can't ever recall anything that wasn't pleasant, and that's because my contacts were primarily with Mrs. Johnson and with her staff. I mean, granted, Juanita would be on the horn quite often with various and sundry requests, and so would Marvin, for example. But no, not really. I can't think of anything that was anything but he certainly showed his appreciation on family occasions when we were there, and because of our association with the girls, I suppose we had a little bit more opportunity to see him on the other side of the flash bulbs and so forth when nobody else was around, or that was strictly a family gathering or a small private gathering. But I can't. Trying to think. No, I mean, we had all kinds of things going on. For example, I remember one day sitting at my desk and hearing strumming on a guitar and opening up the doors and looking out, and we had the first sit-in at the White House. It was during the war, and a group of kids who ostensibly were there on not an early morning, just on the regular public tour. It was about 10:30 in the morning, and they just plopped themselves down, and there they were until about 8 o'clock that night, when they finally were encouraged to get up and leave. Lots of things like that took place, but I don't recall. I do know that during the Festival of the Arts, when I would stick my head in Eric Goldman's office from time to time. I realized that I should not show my face over in the West Wing if I was going to run into him, only because I'm sure that he was going to lash out at anybody coming along who even closely resembled somebody whose ties to the community of the arts was such. So I did not, I mean, we were so involved in installing that show, but we didn't really have anything to do with either the selection or the invitations or what went on, that I was able to pretty much avoid. But we had to remake and reshape the corridors on the ground floor of the White House, and then also set up for outdoor sculpture out on the south lawn. And as far as I was concerned, it was absolutely one of the great successes of all times. But as far as the press was concerned, it was anything but. And between Robert Lowell and Dwight McDonald and John Hershey and company, it was not the happiest way for the president and Ms. Johnson to look at the arts community.
Go into that a little bit. Who did you take your orders from to get that thing started?
Pretty much Goldman. I mean, Bess was busy on the reception side, and Liz was cranking out press. But Goldman and his associate, a woman named Barbara Lee Diamondstein, were the two people who really, I mean, it had been talked about, and we had gotten some information early on, but they kept changing the date. And when they finally decided on a date, my God, they had 3 weeks to put it together. And so we had stuff being shipped in by air from all over the country. And I mean, these were everything from Grant Wood's American Gothic to some of those large Robert Indiana flag paintings that never stopped. It really was, and Jasper Johns. There were, I'd hate to put a dollar value on what was part and parcel of the paintings, for example. But it was Goldman who really deserves the credit, and I felt awfully badly for him. He was somebody who, when I was an undergraduate majoring in political science and history at Colgate, his books were absolutely the best things that we could possibly have under our belt, and I found him to be so different from Arthur Schlesinger as far as his demeanor and manner, and he was just a very empathetic, warm, genuinely kind individual. But sad to say that this really must have taken the very heart and soul out of him to have to go through this ordeal.
Was Mrs. Johnson much involved in the planning of the?
She certainly knew. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that there were certain meetings, a couple of meetings that I recall being at, but I think she was probably meeting with Goldman on a fairly regular basis, or at least towards the end when things like the John Hershey situation came up, because he was invited, if I remember correctly, as a novelist, and he was going to read from Hiroshima instead, which had been, of course, 2 issues of the New Yorker had been devoted to. And I think she kind of thought maybe he'd be reading, say, from Abel Frodano or one of his other pieces of fiction. He knew the White House. He'd been there during the Truman administration and written a fairly lengthy piece on a day in the life of. Interesting piece if you've never read it. And we all just assumed, because he was a rather gentle, very kindly disposed person, but he decided that he was going to use Hiroshima to talk about bombing and to talk about war. And I know that upset Mrs. Johnson terribly. It really did. But he was not disinvited. I don't know whether Goldman was able to get him to soften things or not, and I cannot recall. I think he did stay with Hiroshima, but whether he changed some of the passages and got out of the statistics and what have you, I'm not certain. But I can remember the one of the receptions, Catherine Drinker Bowen and all manner of people who were so elated that they had been honored in such a way with the invitation to the White House that really colored my memory of afterwards. And I thought, well, I think the front pages of the paper played it up from the war angle. The so-called women's sections of the paper played it up a little differently. I remember talking afterwards to Liz about this, saying that I thought her folks really did a fantastic job. The Isabel Sheltons, Marie Smiths, and some of the others of the local and papers like the Chicago Trib and the LA Times as well.
A little while ago, you excuse me, mentioned staying away from the West Wing and what was going on. What, if you know anything, if you remember anything about the president's reactions during all of this time?
Well, I know that we all expected when the festival was first announced that he would very much be present. And Goldman at one meeting discussed the fact that all that he was expected was to, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, make a few remarks, and that would be it. And once this thing started to build and grow, he not only was not going to be there at 6 o'clock, he wasn't going to be in the White House, he wasn't going to be in Washington, he wasn't going to be any place, but he would take the weekend in Texas. I think it was on a Monday, if I'm not mistaken, that the festival was because I remember being in there all day on Sunday when we were setting up and having worked, kind of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We had to close down the house to tourists because we were putting up fake walls along the glassed-in colonnade area, which would be outside what later became the Jacqueline Kennedy or the East Garden. But because of the paintings and the works that would be exposed to daylight, we had to block all of that out. So that took a good bit of planning and construction, thanks to the shop at the National Gallery of Art. They were extremely helpful. We could do some work in-house, but we really didn't have the wherewithal, and the National Gallery had a good bit of material for temporary exhibits. Anyway, he was just not gonna be there at all, and I don't recall his ever being there. I think he did exactly as he finally threatened, but he let it go on, and Mrs. J was certainly very much part of the scene, and beyond the fact that none of us had very much sleep at that point, I think we all thought it was just absolutely superb. And it's funny how, I guess it is inside the Beltway mentality, that you don't realize sometimes how things are striking outside. But I did feel that it was those fires were being tended by folks who wanted to get their byline front and center, and it was not a time that I had a great deal of affection for the Fourth Estate, but that's neither here nor there.
What about the people on Mrs. Johnson's staff? Give me sort of thumbnail sketches of your reaction to all of them.
Well, they all became family, and they still are. This is the thing. Bess and Tyler were just up for a couple of days. Liz is on the horn. We see Ashton on a fairly regular basis. Barbara and I are godparents, the Catholic godparents for a Presbyterian child of Patsy Derby, Patsy Cheney. They just, I could be here for 5 days on the subject, and it's almost impossible to give a thumbnail of each of them. I will tell you that my introduction to Liz was probably not the happiest. They just arrived. They just moved into their offices over in the East Wing, and she called me to say that she needed to have something done, and I can't even remember what that something was. And I said, Mrs. Carpenter, I think you might be making a mistake here, and I think you really ought to check with so-and-so before that gets done. It's obviously something she wanted me to do, and I was reluctant to do it because I could see certain consequences that were going to be embarrassing. And she said, no, you go ahead and do it, and if anybody needs, and I said, well, and we went back and forth again, and finally I said, Mrs. Carpenter, I just I'm going to have to hang up now because I don't think you really are hearing what I'm saying, and just think this over. So I hung up and she hung up, and I thought, Jesus, Ketchum, you have no business hanging up on this good person. 20 minutes later she called back, and son of a gun, except I'm not quite sure that's how she put it. She said, you're absolutely right, and if I'm ever going down the wrong fork again like that, you make damn sure that you tell me just exactly that, and don't hold back for a second. And from that point on, there's nobody that I'd rather be on a desert island with. I mean, absolutely fantastic. And I was laughing because I had such strong memories of their arriving. I was telling Bess the other day, the dress that she was wearing when she came into the office with Liz to introduce themselves the day they came.
Hold on one second.